Hi, this is Paul. This is part two of the commentary. I did a first video where I covered basically everything after the teaser up until Jordan Peterson's first sermon on Abraham. And so now I'm going to cover the sermon on Abraham and then beyond that, and we'll see how far we get today.
Actually relevant as the story progresses.
That's,
So Abraham has privilege, something that someone had because you wanted it. And so the notion of work itself is the notion of a contract with the future, but the viability of that contract depends on an underlying ethos. Okay, so now let me tell you a story about what that contract, how that contract might be conceptualized. Can you tell me what you think about this? So I've been studying the story of Abraham. He starts out as Abram, by the way, Abram. So he has a different name, which is actually relevant as the story progresses. So
now, just because his name gets changed in Genesis 17 with the covenant of circumcision. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am God Almighty. Walk before me faithfully and be blameless. Then I will make my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your number. Abram fell down, and God said to him, As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you the father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. Now that fruitful and multiply goes all the way back to Genesis 1. Be fruitful, multiply, fulfill the earth. And what you see here is God continuing to pursue the mission that begins in Genesis 1, and now he's going to pursue it through Abraham. Now, part of what's quite interesting in this talk, in sort of the successive sermons that go back between Peterson and Brand, one of the themes is, let's say, I might be able to find this kind of stuff here. Now, I really like the way Jordan is increasingly adding the relationality in this video. Jordan always tells the story of Abraham in a particular way. It's helpful to, if you have a Bible. If you don't have a Bible, get a Bible. You don't have to buy one from the former president for $60. You can find it for free on the internet all over the place. Or you can find it in a hotel room. You can find the Bible's been in public domain a very long time. You can find lots of apps that have the Bible. The Lord said to Abram, Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to a land I will show you. And what's amazing about Genesis 12 is that it is an unconditional promise that he's given. God doesn't say, if you obey me, I'll give you these things. He just says, I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse, and all the people on earth will be blessed through you. He basically gives them this enormous, oversized promise and says, this is, now leave. I'm going to give you these things. Now, part of what is always at tension within Jordan's conception is a rather secularized view. I talked, was it in the question and answer today or was it in the video? There's anticipated salvation and realized salvation. Let's say anticipated often in terms of life of the age to come, and realized in terms of this world. And Jordan tends to focus on this world. I've mentioned before that there's a lot of immanentization that he does with this. And within that immanentization with a lot of these, and you'll hear this through Jordan's treatment of the covenant, basically it'll be very conditional. And conditional in almost a mechanical deistic sense. And again, for that sort of a God number one sense, that if you do these things happen. If you treat your body better, you'll have better health. If you treat your relationship better, you'll have better relationships. And so there's sort of a mechanistic element to that. And this is where often, sometimes when you listen to Jordan, he'll focus on sort of the idea of God. Now, in the last video, I mentioned this video that I made with John Vervaeke 4 years ago. And the main thrust of this argument that I was giving John was relationality. That relationality is a fundamental basis for the journey, for interchange, for progress, for human beings actually walking a long path of transformation into a future. Now, I wrestle whether or not to bring this up, because part of the difficulty of the whole John Vervaeke Hermes thing is that things can get out of hand very quickly with respect to this conversation. But part of what's happening with John and this new Hermes episode is much more of a personal relationality coming in to the journey for John. And this came through pretty clearly in his conversation with Nate Heil on Grail Country.
But I am very much trying to bridge between those antinomies. So I think that lands perfectly. The idea that this has to be something that one undertakes not only theoretically, but as you said, in a spiritual exercise and Hadot's sense, I take it, that lands very much for me. I mean, that's why I'm endeavoring on the philosophical Silk Road. That's all about that kind of endeavor can't be a merely theoretical. It can't even be about the teaching of practices. It has to have a pilgrimage aspect to it. And so that's all landing very resonantly with me. I experience Hermes. He presents himself to me as the personified presence of vertical and horizontal participation. And that is something I've been, of course, wrestling with theoretically. And it has shown up of its own accord, of his own accord to me, and unexpectedly. If you had asked me about like the Greek pantheon, although I don't think he fits sort of cleanly into the Greek pantheon or something like that, I wasn't very interested in Hermes as a character. It was very startling to me. But yeah, I experience him as very much a way of trying to imaginally enact all of this talk about transformative participation, deep participatory knowing, deep perspectival transcendence, in a way that I can share with other people. That is that in a way that hopefully will be helpful to them. So everything you said landed extremely well.
Now, there will be a lot more to say about this. I took some notes on this video. I still have to get all the way through the whole thing. John and I have we've calendared a conversation about this ourselves. But again, my point here is if you look at the trip line between the trip line that I think was created by the Scientistic Lab League, the trip line has everything to do with personal relationality. And it's okay to think about the universe as a vast machine. And in many ways, since deism, the imagination of the universe as a vast machine has sort of held. And maybe now people think of it a little bit more digitally, but sort of as a vast machine. And the line... Everybody imagines that the line of magic that you ought not cross is, let's say, speaking to the machine. And now that we have machines that we can speak to, well, that line sort of falls apart. The line, again, if you read Ezekiel Kaufman, I think he makes a really good argument. The line difference is not whether or not you can speak to it. And it isn't even, it has much more to do with relationality, because the assumption of magic in all of the other civilizations except for revolutionary monotheism that you find with the Hebrews. It was magic because basically gods are doing magic and people are doing magic because you have a meta-divine realm which is impersonal and therefore not relational, that it cannot distinguish between persons. Whether it is you doing it or someone else doing it, that is sort of this democratic vision that we have. Whereas when it comes to relationships, it's a wholly different thing. How I respond to my wife or my sons or members of my church or people that I'm in a relationship with is different than how I respond to a stranger. Jesus continually talks about this in terms of, Lord, Lord, did we not heal the sick and raise the dead and do all these great things? And Jesus says, depart from me, I never knew you. And it's interesting that, again, it's always premised on God's knowledge of us. And so to watch both Jordan and John now opening the door to relationality, both of them as scientists, this is an enormous change. And this is, if you go all the way back and you look at me listening very closely to atheist Christian things, almost always the tripwire is relationality. And basically, and again, if you listen to John further in, he will make the argument that, well, actually, even scientifically, this bias against relationality is coming down. And you see that with Jordan, and you see that with John. And that was, in many ways, the point that I was making to John way back when I said, why relate to a personal God? I basically made a PowerPoint. We talked about that, and he gave his critique, and it was a wonderful conversation, and I'll put the link again in this one. All right, back to Abram and relationality. And so he's going to lean into covenant, that covenant is relational.
Abraham has privilege in modern parlance. He's got rich parents, and everything he needs is right at hand for him.
And what Jordan is doing here in this sermon is contextualizing Abraham to sort of bring him up to date and have him be a personal character that we can identify with him. This is basic homiletics.
It begs the question, of course, what is it that you actually need? But what Abram has is kind of like he's got the materialist paradise at hand. There's nothing that he doesn't have at hand whose absence would cause privation. So I would say he's a fully satiated infant. And you can think about that as a notion of utopia. It's the notion of utopia that Dostoevsky criticized, by the way. And what happens to Abraham, he's like 75, and the Spirit of God comes to him.
Now, before we get that, I think this is a notion of utopia, but it's also a notion of paradise that you will often hear. A lot of people's imagination of paradise is that of a satiated infant. And I tend not to think so. I think all that God has prepared us for in this life, to reign with him in the age to come, in the new heavens and new earth, I don't know what it'll be like. I talked about that in the question and answer this morning. But I don't think it will just be Wall-E. All of us overweight and riding on cloud riders, watching Netflix.
That's how the story lays itself out and says, look, buddy, you got to get the hell out of your zone of comfort. You have to leave your father's tent. You have to leave your people. You have to leave everything that's made you comfortable, and you have to journey out into the world. And Abram agrees to this deal. Okay, so as soon as he agrees that he's going to forego his infantile comfort, even though he's like 70 by this time, so he's a bit of a late bloomer, God offers him a deal. This is the covenant. And so I think it's a description of the consequences of the full manifestation of the spirit of adventure. So imagine that there's a spirit.
Okay. How am I going to proceed with this? So here's my NIV study Bible, Zondervan Publishing, almost worn out. My parents gave it to me in Christmas, 1985. Right there at the front. Dad and Mom, Christmas 1985. Let's see, was it Dad or Mom's handwriting? I think it's Dad's. So, yeah. And here's what it has to say about covenants, major covenants in the Old Testament. Let's see if we can go up here. The Noahic covenant, and then Abraham covenant A. It's a royal grant. Participants made righteous, his faith is credited to him. Now, obviously, this is a Reformed study Bible. You're reading it in some ways through Paul in the book of Romans. But the royal land grant is an unconditional divine promise to fulfill the grant of the land, a self-maledictory oath symbolically enacted, and that's in Genesis 15. Genesis 17, it's a suzerain vassal grant. So it's a grant from, it's a covenant from a superior, which is God, to an inferior, who is Abram. Made with Abraham, and that's where he changes his name. So the land grant comes and he doesn't change his name. The suzerain vassal, now Abram is becoming the Lord's vassal, and Israel will be the Lord's vassal. And you can see all of these relationships set up, and now Israel as the Lord, and Abram as the Lord's vassal will fulfill the mission of God set out in Genesis 1. A conditional divine pledge to be Abram's God and God of his descendants, as for me, as for you. The condition, total consecration to the Lord as symbolized by circumcision. Jordan won't get into circumcision at this point. Where are we? Here we are.
Spirit within you that calls you to a more profound level of development. It's the spirit that you would encourage, if you had any sense, if you had in your children, if you had children. You're launching them into the world. You're saying, follow the spirit of adventure. Okay, so God offers Abraham a deal. He says, if you do this and you make the necessary sacrifices.
Now this is obviously there's a universalizing that Jordan is doing here. He's sort of taking something which is very much contained within a relationship of a superior and an inferior, of a great king and a vassal. And Jordan's sort of making it, he's sort of, again, in some ways depersonalizing it and sort of making it mechanistic. And this is sort of a pattern in a lot of what Jordan does, whereas I would say that the form of covenant is quite a bit more relational than Jordan, sort of the undertones that Jordan has here.
Then you'll live a life that will be a blessing to you. That will happen in a manner that will redound to your reputation. So you'll become known, but in a way that, in the right way to become known. You'll become influential and admirable in the proper manner as a consequence of undertaking the adventure.
Now, I'm not sure why Russell was shaking his head, but he just seems ready to pounce. I'm waiting for my turn in this preach off.
You'll do that in a way that will establish something permanent. So that's a dynasty with innumerable descendants because of the pattern that you're establishing. And you'll do all of that in a way that's maximally beneficial to everyone else. So the case is being made in that story that there's no difference between the direction that the spirit of adventure orients you and the provision of plenty psychologically, socially, and over the longest possible span of time. And that's the covenant. And so the notion would be that, and this is what is portrayed to Abraham, is that there's no better possible way of conducting yourself psychologically or socially, all things considered, well, in this story, than following this voice that calls you out into the world. Now, when Abram does go into the world, all hell breaks loose, right? He encounters famine and tyranny and war, and that calls on him to become increasingly more than he is.
Now again, critiquing a bit Jordan's framing here. If you read the Genesis passage and you go through, I was like, oh, I should have scanned more pages of the Bible. What am I thinking? If you read the Genesis passage, at each point, it isn't so much that Abram is this heroic adventurer. Abraham is in fact not doing real well. Time after time, he should make a different choice and God bails him out. And so he goes to Egypt. Sarai's she's very beautiful. She's my sister. But the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Sarah. And well, that was before chapter 17. And then you have the 3 visitors. And there's definitely progress in Abraham. And of course, you can go back to my adult Sunday school classes on the book of Romans. Paul basically makes the argument that God is building up Abraham through this relationship of faith. And Jordan's exposition is just sort of flat. Here's all of this world out there, and it's up to you to be the hero, to maximize this. And the story is very much that God is watching and leading. God is the main character of the Bible. God is the main character of the book of Genesis. And God is bringing up Abraham into his potential. And so, but again, with Jordan, it's rather secularish. It's rather cut off from on top.
Every time he has a new field of adventure that reveals itself in front of him, he's called upon to make a sacrifice. He has to change. He has to let go. He has to abandon the parts of him that are no longer appropriate to the new situation. And he does that
Again, this is sort of what he has to abandon is his self-salvationism. And what he has to lean into is his relationship with the God who has called him and has been shaping this journey all along.
Intensely, so intensely that he is eventually rewarded with a new name, which is Abraham, instead of Abram. He becomes a new person. It's a good way of thinking about it. So, and
now again, chapter 17, when he's given the new name, rewarded, yes. But Abram has not been getting A's with every adventure. In fact, and you're going to see the same thing with the Jacob cycle, that in fact, when the Lord at Bethel tries to give Jacob the same royal land grant that he gives Abraham, Jacob turns it into a condition. So, yeah.
Well, obviously, Abraham is called upon to make an ultimate sacrifice, which is the sacrifice of his son, Isaac. And that's part and parcel of the notion that everything that you have is to be offered up to the thing that's highest that pulls you forward. It's something, and that's what God is. That's part and parcel of the story. It's a definition of what's to be put in the highest place. That's a contract.
I get it. I like the mirroring of Abraham.
and of course, you don't have the camera. Well, the camera was on him the whole time, but he's just waiting. I get it. My turn at the preach off.
Sacrifice in the Old Testament and the sacrifice of Christ as the apex event in the New Testament, that there is an inversion of that principle. I enjoy too the idea that the endowment of spirit and the spirit of adventure is the maximal principle of a great father. I enjoy this idea very much as well. And
now notice Brand put the relationality in there more strongly. Again, part of what's happening is Jordan is sort of Jordan is sort of driving his own car with respect to this relationship with God. And that, well, talking to Bishop Barron, I'm talking to these people who are in my seminar, I'm talking to Jonathan Peugeot. Russell Brand is, to one degree or another, being discipled by a church. I would hope that whatever church is baptized in, that he is at least involved with some degree of catechesis, and it seems that Russell is in fact learning as he's going.
Wondering, Jordan, whilst you were speaking about the values that may entail, because a little earlier when you were talking about money being sort of one of the establishing principles for community and the way that values can be maintained and community can be maintained, and you said it's an expression of ethos and a demonstration of ethos. I feel that one of the contemporary arguments that rages, that you often find yourself significantly and visibly placed on one side of, is the idea that sort of this ethos and these values have become co-opted over time. Now, I know you often talk about how sort of that conservatism versus progressivism is a necessary cultural tension, and you know that many of your detractors and opponents would easily and definitively use the word patriarchy to describe some of these relationships and what they have culturally endowed, and what perhaps they would argue we as men are oblivious to some of the components that are packed into that. What I've come to query is the impossibility of perhaps the equality that it is stated they crave within that framing, i.e. that something that comes from this, forgive the literalism, Genesis, would always have to be expressed in this manner. And to create a paradigm that represented a true expression of the divine feminine, it would have to be a different paradigm altogether. This is interesting to me, bearing in mind what you've said earlier about AI being a sort of a conglomerate, an aggregation that could be mapped onto our understanding of a collective unconscious, i.e. archetypes emerge out of...
Okay, a lot has gone through there. So he is sort of coming back. Now Brand is a really strange mixture of things in his culture warrior mode. He's by no means a traditional conservative. He's sort of a so if you look at, and I'm old enough to remember the hippie movement and the counterculture, the values that they had. You know, Michael Martin, the sociologist, is, if you follow him on Twitter, I spoke with him he's been on the channel. I spoke with him in Washington, D.C. He and Russell Brand, I sort of, they're not too far apart from each other in a whole number of ways. And so Russell, kind of goes after, critics of the Bible because of the patriarchy, and there needs to be a different story, one that is contaminated with patriarchy. And that's what the critics are saying.
Patterns observed over time. But what fascinates me also, because I feel it might be practical, for surely as a theology evolves from the Old Testament into the New Testament, is there a sense, without yielding what territory might be inferred to Islam here, if we were to continue the trajectory to the insisted final prophet, that what we are offered in Acts, for example, in the immediate era after Christ's death and resurrection, is that the kind of divinity endowed by the second covenant, God's reversal, inversion and return on Abraham's sacrifice, might become not ubiquitous, but at least accessible to many.
Okay, now that was a lot. And again, Brand is clearly being discipled by Christians. Where to begin with this? The point I made a little earlier was Jordan tends to take the Old Testament and look for patterns And again, a lot of this is this immanentizing. And so here are the patterns. And once you know the patterns, you as the hero of your story can go out into the world. And I just already said that it's not really the perspective, in my opinion, of the book of Genesis, that the Lord is the hero of the story. And he, in fact, is guiding Abraham, and he is guiding people through this. He's calling Abraham, he's choosing Abraham, he is guiding Abraham through his path, through the world, towards the ends that God is using people to achieve for his world and for his people. Now, Brand is going to take this whoosh, all the way up to Jesus, through Jesus, crucifixion, resurrection, and Russell, you should include the ascension, because the ascension is a critical part of that whole narrative. And then, of course, in the book of Acts, when the Holy Spirit is available, and Brand has sort of implicitly brought in Paul and the book of Romans, that now these blessings giving to Abraham and his seed are available through Abraham. Again, read the book of Romans 4, 5, and 6. About how through faith now these are available not only to Jews but to Gentiles alike.
That we will perform greater feats than he, that you, my apostles, will perform greater feats, that as...
And of course, this is a promise of Jesus. And so it's interesting in the way that Peterson sort of universalizes it as a playing field upon which the hero should go. And Brand sort of universalizes it in terms of wonder working. My sermon would have something to say about that. So this will probably come out on Monday. So yeah, the rough draft is out.
He has sent me as his apostle, I send you as my apostles. I read Acts again recently in some easy, accessible, almost slang version of it. In fact,
Eugene Peterson's The Message. The Message has been an interesting and sometimes controversial paraphrase of the Bible. I've used it in my adult Sunday school class. Some of you might remember that I would always use multiple translations, paraphrases and so in this last time when I was sort of challenged by some people in the corner to not just use committee translations, which of course the major biblical translations out there are committee translations. So I used David Bentley Hart, N.T. Wright, and Eugene Peterson. And of course, with Peterson's paraphrase, you get a very different telling. But for someone like Brand, it's sort of an introduction into a theology already baked into the paraphrase.
a man who shares your surname, Eugene Peterson's book, The Message. And what I was struck by in this version of Acts was the vivacity, the lividness and vitality of the book. And
you'll get that through Eugene Peterson's translation. Now, how well that will wear, because already Eugene died a few years ago, and the language is of its day already. And what tends to happen with many of those paraphrases is that they are using colloquialisms that are very much of the moment, and they get passé quickly.
How the sense of urgency of Christianity, that it, you know, think of the critiques that are often slung in your direction. Conservatism, it's stayed. Like, you know, this is a very sort of, and admittedly it's 2,000 years old, but a very sort of a vibrant call to arms, an urgent sense that, oh my God, we're living in an atrophying and dying ideology. We must become alive with Christ. We must change the world. And even the account.
Okay, now there was the teaser, and I don't think I'm going to do it right now, but it would be fun to sort of take this little clip from here and then take the teaser and see if they sort of really micro-edited it to get exactly the Daily Wire message in the teaser that they wanted. I don't know. I don't know if Daily Wire's doing this. I don't know if Michaela's doing this. But again, Brand here is full of, and Brand is always full of enthusiasm. But Brand here is full of enthusiasm as an evangelist, as a new convert, as someone who's recently baptized. But again, also with Brand, you very much definitely have within him the hope that he himself will experience transformation through this. That is what he is looking for. But again, he is also looking for cultural transformation through this. One of the videos that I want to do is, I've mentioned in a few videos, civilizational Christianity or cultural Christianity. And I think it'd be good to sort of take a walk through the last 150 years with respect to some of these ideas. Because as I said in the previous video, when cultural Christianity was having its way and sort of assumed, churches kind of took a next step forward to say, okay, we don't want you to just be cultural Christians or civilizational Christians. We want you to be personal Christians. And now part of what has happened is we have had the switch over to one of the main religions is activism. And so that's very much a religion, and the activism is clearly downstream of Christianity, but there are different rituals, there are different formulas, there's a different imaginary involved.
Accounts that are given in there are accounts of people jailed and on trial, that even though it is literally biblical, they're not. It's very distinct from the Old Testament with its locusts and its deserts and its tribes and its manna. Now it sort of feels overtly and literally political.
Okay, now that's very interesting because, of course, he sees... When Jordan goes through the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, with his seminar, they very much have a political edge to it. And they are looking for patterns that will be deployed in terms of political wisdom. The New Testament very much has a different focus because, of course, we're not dealing with prophets and kings and national leaders when you're looking at, okay, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, Judah, they're patriarchs. And then you get Moses, Joshua, Samuel, David, Solomon, and then the 2 nations. And the focus in the Old Testament is very much on the kingdom. And then when you get to the New Testament, the kingdom game is behind the scenes, and you can see that at the book of Acts, the beginning of the book of Acts. After everything that happens in the Gospels, the question on the lips of the disciples for Jesus after the crucifixion and resurrection is, now will you restore the kingdom to Israel? And so that framework of a political kingdom is first on their minds, and Jesus basically pivots, sidesteps the question and says, it's not for you to know the times and the dates, but basically power will come upon you in the Holy Spirit, and you will be my witnesses. And so this then leaves Christianity in many ways with this open question with respect to, well, what is the relationship between the church and kings and later what we will call the state? Now, of course, Islam sort of has that. Catholicism developed it, Orthodoxy developed it, Protestantism innovated in it to achieve what we would know as the United States. And that sort of civilizational Protestant civilization without a state church reaches its peak, let's say, at the end of the Second World War with the establishment of the United Nations and the UN Declaration of Human Rights, deeply Protestant mainline documents. And then the Protestant mainline sort of holds firm throughout the Cold War, and after the Cold War, it becomes in decline. The evangelicals begin to rise. And part of the issue is this question about how do Christians relate to the government? I talked to Redeemed Zoomer, that's now out on the channel. And this becomes very interesting because, for example, even people in the Christian Reformed Church like Kristen Kobes Dumay you almost wonder, when she has such a ardent critique of conservative evangelicals and their political aspirations, to what degree has she simply assumed sort of an Anabaptist approach? Because the Anabaptists, in many ways, especially after the stumble at Munster, the Anabaptists very much become, my kingdom is not of this world. We are going to practice the way of Jesus. We are not going to be involved in politics. You're not going to find a lot of Anabaptist principalities around the world. You'll find Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed, and then what happens with these English dissenters, of course, some of them will go to America. And so you have Anglicans and Puritans and Pilgrims, and then Quakers will come into the mix. And when they have to put a government together, they sort of want to keep their own religion separate in their states, but with but that finally doesn't really work. And so then they have the Constitution under which the United States is now. The state churches eventually go away because they were churches of states, because, and remember, we don't have provinces, we have states. And so you have all of this development, and a lot of what develops in America is this very strange system where you don't have a central church and a central state sort of vying for each other, vying for itself. If you read, there's a very interesting book that Cale Zeldin put me up to called Vatican I, and a lot of the question there is ultramontanism, which is over the mountains, meaning Italy, versus Gallicanism, which is, of course, who rules the church in France? Is it the king, or is it the Pope over the mountains? And so then if you read Tom Holland's book Millennial, or what was his, that was the name in the UK, basically he goes into the tensions between church and state, which then become the tensions between eternity and secularity. And that's where religion is always, politics is now. So we're dealing with, in many ways, now that real pluralism is afoot in the American system, where a certain implicit Protestant agreements could be had before and a Protestant hegemony could be had before. Now suddenly in the United States, you have real questions. And some would say, yes, that's because the America needs a state church, and let it be Catholic or let it be Orthodox. Yeah, or let it be Anglican, but the Anglicans and the Catholics and the Orthodox over in the old world, they're not faring much better either.
So what I'm saying is that somehow, like, between these two sets of books, and I don't know how arbitrary that taxonomy is even, Jordan, obviously it must be an area of your expertise by now, having sort of watched the incredible content you've generated around it. Has there been a significant reversal of charge, and what is that charge? How are we endowed with that charge now? At the point when you have Richard Dawkins saying, I am culturally Christian, are people starting to recognize that there is that this is not just a remnant ideology, this is a living thing that has been discarded? I listened to that Bishop Barron, who you had on your show the other day, talking about ethereal angels, and I thought, yes, the religion that I am interested in is not a precursor and a parallel to psychotherapy. It is a precursor and parallel to quantum physics, helping me to understand what do you.
And this is some powerful preaching on the part of Brand. And again, he is basically saying to Jordan, okay, you're looking for psychological patterns in the Bible. I want it at the base level of existence. I don't want God, an idea of God that's up here in my head. I want a God that is the foundation. And so, again, in many ways, well, we're back to Ezekiel Kaufman, revolutionary monotheism, not another God within the meta-divine realm who does magic and basically knows the secret code better, but instead the God who is all in all.
Mean when you say self? Who is this self? What do you mean when you say reality? When you say reality, what are you talking about? And is it possible that reality is something that we conjure here as vessels and conduits of the divine?
See, now Russell's New Ageiness is coming through. And this is why Russell is a very strange mixture of a whole bunch of things. So is this reality that we conjure? Well, conjure. Well, there's a very interesting word to bring forth in this context, because again, back to Ezekiel Kaufman, you have this meta-divine realm where things are conjured, because that's sort of the mechanism of the world. And again, Jordan isn't doing that, but Jordan is looking at patterns. And again, the patterns are God number one-ish. They're sort of impersonal. And so Brand wants it more personal, but the personal, well, what about us? And how do we participate in the quantum physics of the world?
If we have the capacity to somehow in the moment through practice disavow the strong gravitational, literally, pull of the material and the unconscious ethos with which we are continually inculcated by the insidious, nihilistic, or albeit glistening culture that attempts to make us all devotees of this new banality.
Okay, there was, oh, no, we're going to get a commercial. There was a lot in that, but again, you can still see Russell Brand, who comes at this from New Age, and there are a lot of, so interesting. I haven't listened to enough of Russell Brand to have an understanding of what might be the implicit ontologies beneath this language that he's bringing to the conversation. All right, let's get beyond Beam and Peterson's response.
To go find to be given the 10 Commandments. He leaves his to be. Well, when the
now Brand asked him a question, and is there going to be an answer? We just had a sermon on Abraham, and now we're going to get a sermon on Moses. Maybe.
When Moses disappears to go find to be given the 10 Commandments, he leaves his political arm behind, right? Aaron. So there's two forces that lead the lost.
Okay, and this is another big theme that Peterson has been working for a number of years, which is the political. Again, political is now, religion is always. And when people lose their religion, they tend to expand their political, and it plays the role of religion in their lives. I would have liked to have engaged Brand a little bit more on Brand's question, but that's just me.
Across the desert, there's the prophetic and the political, and Aaron is the political. And in that part of the story, the prophetic disappears, and the political falls under the sway of something like the immediacy of hedonism. So the Israelites immediately turn to worship of the golden calf, and it's something like money. So a calf is obviously calf is in the class of livestock, and livestock is bodies at hand to consume. It's a form of wealth, obviously. And golden calf is the first level representation of that abstractly, you might say. It's halfway to money, a golden calf, but it's still materialistic. Now, when the Israelites start to worship the golden,
this isn't disconnected from what Brand said, because part of Brand's, from what I can tell, part of Brand's MO is, again, sort of like this hippie leftover. got some Marxism in there. When people all sort of always imagine that money is the base root of what everybody really thinks of, that it's all basically about money. Of course, Peterson's been undermining that quite a bit. So he's going to want to address maybe Russell Brand's presupposition that, well, it's just greed that's been corrupting everything. And so he'll agree with that, well, the golden calf, for many cultures around the world, cattle is their livestock, and it's how you secure wealth. And of course, a golden calf, you have that bull on Wall Street, the famous bull. A golden calf is sort of an idolic representation of hedonism. And again, this is going to be a big theme with Peterson, and it's already connected with Abraham, that Abraham has to leave his hedonistic life in order to pursue a meaningful life.
Golden calf and become materialistic. They become concerned with immediate hedonistic self-gratification. Okay, and so then, and it isn't only that they're worshiping the golden calf, they're dancing around naked, drunk. It's a pride parade. I mean, and I'm dead serious about that. I'm dead serious about that. Is the political descends into a pride parade as soon as the prophetic disappears. Well, why? Well, because everyone falls under the sway of the dominion of their immature instincts. You know, when someone says, I want what I want right now, what they're failing to understand is that they've come to a conclusion about what constitutes I. And the I that they're allowing to be constituted is actually the dominion of their instincts. They're reverting to the same sort of behavior that characterizes Abraham before his adventure takes place. It's mere hedonic immediate gratification. Now, you might say, if you were progressive, it's like, well, what's wrong with that? And the answer is, well, why don't you put 42-year-olds out in the forest and see how long they last? And the answer is not very long. And the reason for that is because there's nothing in that realm of instinctual self-gratification that's going to be able to propagate itself communally over any reasonable amount of time. I mean, that's why we have communal organization, why we make those sacrifices, is because as you mature, you start to understand that mere whim or mere desire, first of all, is a pretty narrow definition of who you are, especially because it changes moment to moment, just like gender, apparently. Right? It's this shape-shifting. It's actually an a priori decision about what to worship. Like if you're a pagan, for example, and you're polytheistic, for example, all that it means is that it doesn't mean you worship nothing. It means that you identify yourself with your instinctual desires. You define I as whatever desire rules at the moment. That's just a kind of possession, and it's an immature possession, and it can't work because there's nothing in it that's productive. It's all mouth and need and no action and sacrifice. And so there's something wrong about it, fundamentally wrong about it. Something fundamental. That's the land of Peter Pan, right? The boy who won't grow up, who thinks that maturity is nothing but like power and corruption. That's represented by Captain Hook. Now, to give the progressives their due, to give the left its due, of course that patriarchal structure that is predicated on sacrifice can become corrupted, co-opted, gigantic, right? Lumbering, blind, willfully blind. It degenerates in the direction of power always. So this is a good rule of thumb. And you can think about this in the confines of...
Now, this is a great sermon. I think it's really good. I think it's excellent. But I just want to notice he's not he's bringing it to the psychological. He's also bringing it to the individual. And so he's basically saying that the transformed individual is the hope of the world. And when people are not transformed as individual, they go out and basically project the instincts of a 2-year-old out onto the political system, and it's a catastrophe for everyone. He hasn't really brought it down to, let's say, the quantum level. Now Brand is using quantum level, symbolically in that sense, because the most foundational level. Peterson could be, in a sense, pivoting and say, well, I think the individual psychological level is foundational, and if that gets straight, the political will be in better shape.
Of your marriage or even your relationship with yourself, right? When the proper integrating spirit isn't at hand and operative, then the relationship degenerates in the direction of power. You start to use compulsion. You start to use force. You exchange angry words with your wife and you attempt to force her to adopt the point of view that you think is appropriate. But the fact that that happens continually does not indicate that that's the basis of the relationship. Right? It's not, is power the basis of the relationship? Well, the progressives obviously say yes. They say there's...
I really wish they had just kept the dual camera on, both of them, most of the time, because Brand is just fun to watch. He's not sitting there stoned. He's got his Bible, he's got his pen, he's doing his things.
There's nothing other than power. That's what the bloody postmodernists concluded in the 1970s. And if it's not power, what is it? Well, it's the spirit of voluntary self-sacrifice. That's the antithesis of power. That's clearly the antithesis of...
Okay, so Jordan has in some ways made his way all the way to Jesus without naming him yet.
Power. And then you mentioned, I'll just add one thing, because you mentioned this call that you saw in Acts, which is Christ's insistence that those he leaves behind will do works greater than his. This is also where I see the insipid element of Protestantism.
And again, before we get to Protestantism, you will be my witnesses. Again, for both of them, there's sort of a focus on the potential, but who is driving the potential? And you sort of, again, like you have this, you're not seeing this in the book of Genesis, where it is God, in fact, who's the main actor that's driving it. And when you get to the book of Acts, it's very clear that it's the Holy Spirit that keeps driving the story in there. And in some ways, they both start just coming back to us leading and God as potentiality, rather than God leading and us as servants and the medium through which God is working in the world. And you will be my witnesses.
Particular, although not only Protestantism, that says, well, all you have to do is say, Lord, Lord, and you'll be saved, right? All you have to do is claim belief in the Christ who's already redeemed us, and then, now you're in the kingdom of heaven. And
okay, now we're going to get into this question of, well, what exactly is the nature of this salvation? And for Jordan, it will often tend to be, well, here's all this potentiality. You'd better go out and use this potential. You better wield this potentiality in the right way. And if you do, you'll be rewarded. Now, of course, there is the law of sowing and reaping. But again, Genesis, it is God that is the mover. Acts, it is the Holy Spirit that is the mover. That doesn't come through with either of them in this conversation. Maybe I'll take it to the end of this sermon and then call this one here, because I am running out of time.
That isn't what the biblical text indicates. It indicates that those who are left in the aftermath of the resurrection will be called upon to do greater things than Christ himself, which is a hell of a call given the nature of his sacrifice. Right,
but it's tremendously undirected. Oh, you're just going to do greater things. That is not what the book of Acts says. Begin at the beginning of the book of Acts. Acts, now will you restore the kingdom to Israel? That's where the Old Testament kingdom and then the aspirations of the disciples that Jesus puts off. sort of sidestep and says, it's not for you to know the times or the dates, but you will be my witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, and to the ends of the earth. That is the call. To do greater things than me, that is mentioned, but that is not the call. You can use the Great Commission. You can use all of these different things, but they're, you can't really blame them. I mean, Jordan is doing a lot of studying, but Jordan's study, again, tends to be directed by him. Russell's study, at least, is ostensibly, hopefully, under some guidance of some church, but it's quite clear they're missing God number two still, in terms of it has been God, Jordan, you've been in his hands. Did you notice that you almost died? Your wife almost died. Both of you have been spared, and that neither of you were spared by your own hand. And, Russell Brand with his 12-step, you get this from AA, and Russell will mention AA later, and I think that's part of the reason why Brand, towards the end of their preach-off, will bring in God's grace more clearly than usually we see Jordan talking about.
Is no joke. And what we're called upon to do is to participate in that process, right? Fully, or else, and seriously, or else. And everybody can feel that nipping at the edges.
Okay, what everybody feels nipping at the edges is the fact that the civilizational Christianity is crumbling.
Including people like Richard Dawkins.
Let's hold it there. And obviously, Russell is ready to go with his response. But I am out of time for now, so this will do for this episode. Let me know what you think. Leave a comment.